According to Poppy Bush himself, he named his oil company Zapata Petroleum after his favorite film, the 1952 picture Viva Zapata, starring Marlon Brando. The film tells the story of Mexican revolutionary hero Emiliano Zapata in his guerrilla struggle against the Mexican government during the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. The naming Zapata Petroleum is of course ironic, given Bush's continued siding with reactionary elements across Latin America, in contrast to the real Zapata's revolutionary legacy. Also, I highly doubt that Viva Zapata was actually Poppy Bush's favorite film, as it had just come out the year before he created the company, unless it really left an impression on him. Either way, the original financing for Zapata Petroleum came largely from his silent partners, most prominently Bush's maternal uncle Herbert Walker Jr. and his friend Eugen Meyer, the owner of the Washington Post. Poppy was supported by his wealthy business partners as well, Hugh and Bill Litkey, wildcatters from Tulsa, Oklahoma that Bush had met while in Midland, Texas. The Litkeys were already prominent oil men in their own regards, who would bring their expertise to Zapata Petroleum. According to Russ Baker, the Litkeys led Zapata to drilling 127 consecutive quote-unquote wet holes, leading to a massive increase in Zapata's stock price in the early years. Zapata Petroleum, largely thanks to the Litkeys' legitimate oil industry experience, was quickly booming. Alongside these seemingly legitimate and respectable investors was a previously mentioned mystery man named Thomas Devine, or Devine, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I'll say Devine. An MIT graduate who, according to his official New York Times obituary from 2019, had been a CIA staff officer since his graduation in 1949. Devine's association with Bush's Zapata almost guarantees that the company worked as some sort of agency front. Devine, much like Bush, differed from the other Zapata Petroleum partners, as he came from the same upscale Yankee world as Poppy, and not the cowboy world of the Southwest. Born in Rochester, New York, Devine would eventually be inducted into the Council on Foreign Relations much later in life, the Rockefeller-dominated Yankee think tank that counted as members the highest echelons of Northeastern power. Devine was, much like Poppy Bush, an emissary from the white shoe, WASP circles of the old establishment to Texas. It is unsurprising, then, that the CIA's Thomas Devine and the CIA's George Bush apparently got along quite well. In a November 29, 1975 memo for the Deputy Director of Operations at CIA, on screen now, Thomas J. Devine is described as a former CIA staff employee who later became a, quote, oil wildcatting associate with Mr. Bush, end quote, specifically stating that they co-founded Zapata Oil together. The memo states that Devine's effort fell under a terminated project codenamed WUBRINY, or LP Dictum. Now, disregarding the cryptonym for a second, it does appear, though, that Thomas Devine and Poppy Bush's working relationship extended far beyond their time in the oil industry in the 1950s. According to a 1968 CIA memo, on screen now, sent to the Department of Security, Devine is described as being a, quote, personal friend and unofficial foreign affairs advisor to Representative George Bush of Texas. Bush, at the time, serving his first term as a junior congressman from Texas. The memo describes Devine as having a role once again in this project WUBRINY, as a commercial asset for the agency insofar as, quote, and this is important, being a cleared and witting contact in the investment banking firm which houses and manages the proprietary corporation of WUSALINE, end quote. So here we are left with two cryptonyms. First, Project WUBRINY, which many have interpreted as being Devine's codename, or at least the project that he was working for, and the subject WUSALINE, which researchers have theorized as being George Bush's CIA cryptonym. Note as well that both of these cryptonyms are referring to salt in a certain sense. So WUBRINY, the brining process, which is some sort of salination process, and then WUSALINE as in a saline solution, water with salt. So there is clearly a link between these two cryptonyms, and both likely fell under the same program. Now, from my interpretation, and what I'm going to be arguing throughout this last chapter, is that it appears that Thomas Devine was coordinating CIA corporate cover operations in the Caribbean. Operations that used the likes of Poppy Bush and George de Mohrenschildt as Langley cutouts to support their operations in the Gulf of Mexico. The cryptonyms WUBRINY and LP Dictum, as noted in the first memo, appeared to be agency codenames for this project or elements of the project. These types of intel business cutout operations in many ways remind me of a much later CIA project known as In-Q-Tel. Founded in 1999, In-Q-Tel is the CIA's proprietary venture capital firm that provides seed capital to mostly tech startups in return for lucrative agency contracts and in-house software development for the intelligence community. In-Q-Tel is most famous for having provided part of the seed funding for Peter Thiel's Palantir, a now massive Silicon Valley case management and big data dragnet software firm that provides their software services directly to the US intelligence community and the Pentagon under the auspices of counterterrorism. In a sense, Thomas Devine, or as he may have been known, WUBRINY, were undertaking the same operations as their successors in In-Q-Tel, albeit at a much smaller scale and at a lower tech level. The wording in the 1968 memo, specifically alluding to Devine's role as a, quote, witting contact in the investment banking firm which houses and manages the proprietary corporation WUSALINE, end quote, does seem to indicate that Devine's WUBRINY was working to pump seed capital into CIA shell companies and was likely the CIA case officer in charge of Bush and his intelligence business activities. Further indications of Devine's role as a CIA venture capitalist was his close ties to another agency business asset, the Russian-German George de Mohrenschildt, whom, according to Russ Baker, met together in secret in New York City in April 1963 to discuss de Mohrenschildt's ongoing operations in Haiti, a country that he had cultivated deep ties to. So really, there's only one conclusion that can be drawn from these groundbreaking memos. Thomas Devine was likely the CIA case officer assigned to Zapata Oil, and Bush's oil firm was likely an intelligence front in the Caribbean. The two men would subsequently remain close until the late 1960s, even allegedly traveling together to Vietnam in late 1967 and into early 1968 during Bush's first term in Congress. This trip to Saigon almost certainly had to do with increasing CIA activities in the Vietnam War, especially as their visit coincided with the ramping up of the horrifying CIA counterinsurgency operation known as the Phoenix Program, undertaken jointly by the CIA and the Pentagon under the Court's directive. Coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, taking over the operation of the Phoenix Program in late 1968 was CIA mastermind bureaucrat Ted Shackley. Visiting Congressman Bush and his CIA quote-unquote foreign policy advisor Thomas Devine would have likely met Shackley half a decade earlier, first in Florida, while he was acting as station chief at JM Wave Station in Miami from 1962 to 64, while the two men were themselves expanding their firm Zapata Petroleum. Much more on this in my upcoming videos about JM Wave. But these ongoing run-ins with top agency officials provides additional evidence that Bush was a longtime CIA asset, and mystery Zapata man Thomas Devine provides the key to understanding Bush's early relationship with CIA, not as an official spook per se, but instead as a roving emissary, representing Zapata Oil on the outside, but really working for Langley undercover. Even though Zapata Petroleum was almost certainly a CIA front company, it nonetheless made massive profits in the 1950s Texas oil industry. If one had land in the lucrative Permian or East Texas basins, it was hard not to bring in massive profits in this environment. And Zapata Petroleum did own such land, firstly on the Permian in West Texas. Not to mention Bush's main business partners, the Litkey brothers, were themselves legitimate oil men and brought with them a wealth of contacts, resources, and maybe most importantly, a genuine desire to make money to the firm. Unsurprisingly, therefore, Zapata was profitable in its first years out of the gate. With such incredible success, one would think that Bush, the ostensibly independent businessman, would have been content with his newfound personal wealth and steady success as an independent oil tycoon, with lucrative oil drilling land. Yet, In maybe the most eyebrow-raising move of his early career, in 1954, only a year after starting his first oil company to massive success, Bush inexplicably decided to start an offshoot firm to Zapata Petroleum that specialized in the far more technical and risky enterprise of offshore oil drilling, called Zapata Off-Shore. I should note here, just as to not cause any confusion, that so far in this video I've been using the Zapata Off-Shore logo, that being Bush's offshoot firm, interchangeably with the Zapata Petroleum Company that he founded with the Litkeys. The reason for that is that there isn't really a logo for the Zapata Petroleum Company, so I decided to just use the offshore logo as a fill-in. So sorry if that caused any confusion, just thought I'd clear that up. But the logo that I've been using has been for Bush's offshoot firm that he founded a year after the original firm. Just thought I'd clear that up. Bush relocated from Midland, Texas to Houston, his base of operations for the remainder of the 1950s and largely throughout his career, and teamed up with fellow oilman Bill Clements Jr., the president of Sedco Oil Company, a massive international oil firm in its own regard, to develop the new spin-off venture, Zapata Off-Shore. Bill Clements Jr., for his part, would emerge from this point on as a prominent political backer of both George H.W. Bush and the Republican Party more broadly, starting with Richard Nixon in 1968. Clements was eventually rewarded massively for his continuous support of GOP causes, serving as Deputy Secretary of Defense under both Nixon and Ford from 1973 to 77, and then later being elected as Governor of Texas for 2 non-consecutive terms from 1979 to 83 and from 87 to 91. He was the first Republican to be elected governor of Texas in over 100 years, since 1870, representing the completion of Texas's shift away from traditional Southern Democrat interests and firmly into the Republican column. Notably, his 2 terms as governor coincided with Poppy Bush's time as vice president under Reagan and as president of the United States. Returning to Bill Clements and Poppy Bush's early alliance under Zapata Sedco, we can see again how Bush's arrival in Texas does appear to coincide with the emergence of the GOP as a dominant force in the state. Additionally, allying with Bush appeared to spell good fortunes for those who were chosen, as Bill Clements, at the time simply another oil tycoon in the Houston nexus, would be elevated over the next decades to massive political prominence in lockstep with Poppy Bush. What remains so puzzling about Bush's move to Houston and his splintering from the main Zapata brand is that in the mid-1950s, Zapata's West Texas oil plot, courtesy of the Litkeys and Zapata landman John Overby, still contained a bounty of easy-to-extract oil for the taking, which the Litkey brothers continued to exploit with their Zapata Petroleum Company for the following years. Yet, as previously mentioned, Bush decided to completely step away from the profits. Zapata Off-Shore, Bush's offshoot firm with Clements, according to Joseph Trento, turned a small profit in 1955 and 56 before going into the red for over $500,000 in 1957 and 58. During this same time, as Bush's venture began hemorrhaging money from the Zapata Corporation, the Litkey brothers asked for a buyout, which Bush graciously provided to them to the tune of $800,000, allegedly provided by generous Uncle Herbie Walker. The Oklahoman brothers would then use this initial seed capital to merge Zapata with the Pennsylvania-based oil firm South Penn Oil to form the now well-known firm Pennzoil in 1963. Leaving Bush and the Zapata brand behind, the Litkeys became some of the richest men in the United States. To this day, Pennzoil is worth billions of dollars and would propel the brothers to unprecedented wealth and success, without Zapata co-founder George H.W. Bush. The only explanation for Bush's seeming aversion to profits and his unexplainable career sidestep is that Zapata Off-Shore was a CIA pet project, and that Bush was in turn providing corporate cover for intelligence assets. Soon enough, despite continuous losses, Russ Baker notes that Zapata Off-Shore had installed their state-of-the-art mobile offshore rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, the Persian Gulf, and off of the island of Borneo in Indonesia. Zapata Offshore's activities internationally strangely seem to coincide with the CIA's foreign activities as well. Indonesia, for example, where Bush's firm set up a rig in the late 50s, would succumb to foreign meddling when the CIA planned and undertook a failed coup there in 1957 and 58. This period also marked the beginning of Bush's long-standing relationship with the Gulf monarchies in the Middle East, renting one of the first offshore rigs to Kuwait Shell, the major oil producer in the small Gulf kingdom of Kuwait. And as we know today, Kuwait would become synonymous with Poppy Bush. As president, he would lead U.S. forces into Iraq during the First Gulf War, ostensibly in defense of neighboring Kuwait. But in the 1950s, some 40 years earlier, Zapata Offshore represented the first activation of Bush by Dulles as a proper intelligence asset. Not a spy per se, but a friendly and cooperative business contact, under the watchful guidance of WUBRINY Thomas Devine. Joseph Trento relays a quote from former spy William Corson that Bush was, quote, perfect at talent spotting and looking at potential recruits for the CIA, end quote. Additionally, according to John Sherwood, a former top CIA agent under the head of the anti-Castro operations in 1962 and 63, stated that, quote, Bush was like hundreds of other businessmen who provided nuts and bolts assistance such operations require. He was no spy. None of these guys were. What they mainly helped us with was to give us a place to park people that was discreet. End quote. What Sherwood is describing here, and what I have started to explore through Thomas Devine's work in the Caribbean, has also been relayed by such figures as Victor Marchetti, a longtime CIA officer turned whistleblower, who I believe to be one of the more credible sources of insider information about the agency. As relayed in Jonathan Kwitny's book, The Crimes of Patriots, Marchetti describes two types of quote-unquote purportedly private organizations that the CIA relies on in its work. The first is the CIA proprietary firm, a company that on the outside looks privately owned, but in reality is owned entirely by the agency. Kwitny notes Paul Helliwell's companies in Southeast Asia as examples. Principally Sea Supply Corp in Bangkok, and Civil Air Transport, later Air America, as examples of proprietary firms. These quote-unquote companies on the surface look like privately owned entities, but in reality, the entire business is owned by the CIA and its partners directly. There are no private shareholders, and usually the entire seed capital is provided by the agency. Yet these companies do still perform the operations that they advertise, albeit for agency purposes. Sea Supply Corp did ship arms and other supplies to agency-backed Southeast Asian forces. CAT did operate as an airline. Marchetti notes that these proprietaries are allowed to spend their own profits however they choose, but could turn to Langley if they were in need of a cash infusion to buy new planes or weapons to be shipped to armies in the Golden Triangle. But it's the second type of CIA firm, which is described as the quote-unquote CIA front, which appears to encompass such firms as Zapata Offshore. According to Kwitny, a front is, quote, an organization whose purported business is a sham, kept in place to provide a cover for other activities, end quote. Or in other words, quote, it offers a place for agents to get mail or phone calls and provide an answer to otherwise embarrassing questions like, what are you doing here? End quote. Zapata Offshore, for example, was less concerned with drilling for oil and more focused on providing business cover for CIA assets. The reason I bring this up is because Poppy Bush and his cohort of agents, the core of which would end up at the center of the Iran-Contra affair at the end of their careers in the 80s, would be the pioneers of a new privatized and decentralized model of both intelligence funding and plausible deniability. Under ostensible corporate cover, spies were no longer spies. They were now businessmen. Bush was brought into this quote-unquote pilot project at the ground floor as an early purveyor of a CIA front. Throughout his career as an intelligence agent, Bush would work to expand this corporate intelligence web. As a politician, Bush would tap into this web to undertake some of the most widespread, diffuse, and highly criminal operations in CIA history. To better understand this model, let's investigate Bush's first exposure to the new quote-unquote pilot project devised by Dulles to bring private cover for CIA assets in the Caribbean. Poppy Bush would first cut his teeth in the anti-Castro operations, providing corporate cover for Cuban exiles, training to overthrow Fidel Castro in the lead-up to the Bay of Pigs invasion. I should begin by noting that the CIA's official code name for the Bay of Pigs invasion was, interestingly, Operation Zapata, which cannot be written off as a mere coincidence given the alleged role of Bush's oil firm, Zapata Offshore, in the operation. Although Zapata Offshore continuously lost money starting in 1957, this did not prevent the company from expanding throughout those years. Maybe the most conspicuous expansion was in 1958, at the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, to a small offshore plot off of Cay Sal Island, a minuscule Bahamian islet completely apart from the main archipelago. One quick note on Cay Sal that I was pointed towards by a Patreon supporter. The name Cay Sal roughly translates from Spanish to mean Salt Island, which itself ties into the salt theme that the agency appeared to be going for in regards to the WUBRINY and WUSALINE cryptonyms for Bush's Zapata project. The use of Cay Sal Island could have very well been the inspiration for those codenames. Cay Sal is located some 62 miles or 100 kilometers south of the Florida Keys, and only 31 miles or 50 kilometers north of Cuba. Its location made it an ideal staging ground for potential future amphibious invasions of Cuba. It turned out that Zapata Offshore leased the plot next to Cay Sal from none other than billionaire Howard Hughes, who had himself leased Cay Sal a year earlier. According to a 1958 FBI memo, Hughes was reported to have leased Cay Sal from one Clarence O. Moody, who was reportedly Hughes' middleman in delivering support to the Cuban exiles. Hughes was completely embedded in the Zapata offshore operations in South Florida. The same FBI memo makes note of the location of the Zapata offshore offices in Marathon, Florida, right in the middle of the Florida Keys, a series of small islets jutting out of the southern tip of Florida. Not to get too far into the weeds here, but the Florida Keys were a hotspot for both official CIA and off-the-books anti-Castro training operations during this same period. Only a few miles west of Zapata's Marathon, Florida HQ is No Name Key, which would come to house one of the most famous privately funded Cuban exile training camps in the upcoming years. Many have speculated that what came to be known as the No Name Key Group was funded directly by Hughes in some way. We will come back to this later, as the No Name Key Group would later relocate to a rural Louisiana training camp, a camp that many have speculated trained Kennedy's future assassins. But besides Marathon, Florida's proximity to No Name Key, a hotbed of paramilitary activity, according again to the FBI memo, Marathon also housed what seemed to be a Howard Hughes front company known as the Pinellas Fish Company. The memo noted that the docks of this obscure fish company often served as a helipad for Hughes Tool Company helicopters. From the acquisition of the Cay Sal plot, to Zapata's proximity to No Name Key, to the closeness to Hughes front companies, Bush's CIA front activities appeared to intersect and complement Howard Hughes' private intel activities, exemplifying the benefits of an asset such as Bush to the boys at Langley. The CIA could more easily tap into private intelligence networks through these seemingly legitimate business relationships, such as the one between Hughes and Bush, without arousing suspicion by using outright CIA officers. But what was Zapata Offshore really accomplishing for the CIA? According to newspaper articles at the time, Cay Sal Islet was equipped with a small landing strip built on the island when it was previously used by the Bahamian Army as a training site some years earlier. These amenities would undoubtedly come in use, especially as I speculate that Cay Sal may have been used as one of the transshipment points for the CIA-backed arms traffickers out of Louisiana, who were shipping guns to both sides in the Cuban Revolution in the late 50s. As I covered previously in several videos, these weapons smugglers were concentrated around David Ferry and his Civil Air Patrol, with figures such as Jack Ruby and Barry Seal smuggling weapons, maybe even through the airstrip at Cay Sal. Howard Hughes' appearance in this nexus as the owner of Cay Sal Island is of course significant, as he himself embodied a similar role to Bush, with his Hughes Enterprises and his airline TWA providing intelligence cover for agency-linked assets during this same period. I will remind you, for example, that CIA-linked smuggler Barry Seal worked later as a commercial pilot for Hughes TWA, likely using the job as cover. Notably, Poppy Bush himself may have corresponded with Howard Hughes all the way back in the late 40s and early 50s, when he was working for Uncle Malon's Dresser Industries. As it turned out, Dresser had been in ongoing negotiations with Hughes Tool Company to buy their patented oil drill bit, the patent that had started the Hughes family fortune. These negotiations ultimately went nowhere, but we can convincingly draw the connection from Dresser's negotiations with Hughes to a decade later when the billionaire would rent his Cay Sal plot to Poppy's Zapata Off-Shore. Bush would arrange for the installation of his rig, nicknamed Scorpion, off the coast of Cay Sal in 1958. Researchers such as Joseph Trento and Russ Baker have speculated that Bush's Cay Sal Scorpion rig was used as an impromptu training facility for Cuban exiles, many of which were given corporate cover either at Zapata Offshore or in the Mexican oil company Pemex. This type of training, in my estimation, would have likely been for the most elite of the Cuban exiles, given the nature of amphibious exercises and the remote locale of this rig. I picture special operations forces, or maybe like future Navy SEAL type training when I think of offshore rigs. As I covered previously, the most elite of the Cuban exile crop were being funneled into the CIA's Operation 40 to serve as the future intelligence operators of a US-aligned Cuba. Many of these Op 40 agents would remain longtime CIA collaborators into the future. So here I have to highlight this quote from Fabian Escalante, who I will say as a disclaimer was a high-ranking Castro intelligence agent. It is up to you whether his work for Castro brings credence to his statement or invalidates it. Anyways, I still want to share what he said because if what he said was true, then it adds an additional dimension to Bush's role in the Bay of Pigs. Escalante claimed that in the lead-up to the invasion of Cuba, George H.W. Bush and his associate Jack Crichton, you'll remember him as the private Murchison-employed spook we covered earlier, worked to raise funds for the CIA's Operation 40 from the oil tycoons in Houston and Dallas, respectively. This statement, although unverifiable, is backed by some circumstantial evidence. Firstly, as I already covered, Bush's Scorpion rig off of Cay Sal would have provided perfect training facilities for the Operation 40 assassins. Even on a personal level, Poppy appeared to have maintained close relations and even friendships with many of the CIA men and Cuban exiles that were circulating in this Operation 40 environment. Future CIA Director Porter Goss, who would be elevated to that role by Poppy's son, President George W. Bush, from 2004 to 2006. Had started his career with the CIA working in the Caribbean, likely on anti-Castro operations. Interesting to see Porter Goss elevated by Poppy's son to the top job at CIA, when both likely first met in the Gulf of Mexico in the early 60s, and Goss, of course, has been highly rumored to have been involved with Operation 40. I'll remind you, some have speculated that he was in this picture that we covered in the Operation 40 video. Anyways, H.W. Bush would also remain lifelong friends with none other than Felix Rodriguez, the Cuban exile leader of the Operation 40 hit squad. As you can see in these photos, Bush even hosted Felix in the White House while he was vice president. You will remember I said earlier that Bush elevated the people he trusted throughout his career. Well, it may not be a coincidence that while Bush was vice president in the 1980s, Rodriguez would reemerge as a key player in Iran-Contra, specifically in the Salvadoran resupply operations. On screen now is supposedly a 1988 letter written by Bush to Rodriguez wishing him the best in his upcoming trial and expressing his certainty that he is innocent and not implicated in Iran-Contra. Now, the authenticity of this letter does remain in question, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was real. Bush's long-standing personal friendship with the head of Operation 40 does seem to, at the very least, indicate some interaction between the two during the height of the anti-Cuba show, maybe even on the Zapata Scorpion rig. As for private spy Jack Crichton, he had already cultivated deep political ties with pretty much every prominent oil man in Dallas. By this point, since 1956, Crichton had been heading the 488th Military Intelligence Department, a reservist outfit filled with Army intelligence reservists based in Dallas. Not to mention that Crichton was also the Dallas representative for the Empire Trust Company, the holding company of the Cuban-Venezuelan Oil Voting Trust Company, George de Mohrenschildt's oil firm that held the rights to some 50% of the Cuban oil reserves pre-revolution, and were likely more than happy to donate funds to Crichton's alleged fundraising efforts for Operation 40. Rolling back communism in the Caribbean would become a new priority for the cowboy wildcatters, as it would open up new horizons and markets for exploitation. An often unspoken reason as to why these cowboys and the old China lobby favored a policy of rollback in the Cold War was because by rolling back socialism, these entrepreneurs would essentially unlock or quote-unquote open up new markets for exploitation. In Castro's Cuba, for example, the socialist government had worked to nationalize most of the natural resources once controlled by multinational corporations such as Standard Oil and United Fruit. The cowboys, traditionally excluded from these old imperialist multinational trusts of the early 20th century, could therefore finally get their piece of the colonial pie from the remains of the rolled back socialist economy. This represented a significant reason as to why the cowboys were such strong advocates for rollback. It would in turn allow them to expand into overseas markets that were open to reprivatization. It should also go without saying, therefore, that the Texas oil independents were strong advocates of the Nixon-Dulles anti-Castro policies, not only from an ideological perspective, but from an economic perspective too. Cuba had just been scouted as a potential oil-producing country when Batista was overthrown in 1959, and the few wells that had been erected were subsequently nationalized. It was unclear what Cuba's reserves truly held. And to the Texas cowboys, it appeared that Cuba's oil wealth could be a new East Texas field for the tycoons. Regardless of the legitimacy of Castro's spy chief Escalante's claim about Bush and Crichton being covert CIA fundraisers for the Bay of Pigs and Operation 40, the connections between both men does indicate at the very least a working relationship. Some 4 years after their rumored collaboration, in 1964, Bush and Crichton would conspicuously appear on the same electoral ballot, Bush running for U.S. Senate and Crichton running for governor of Texas, both as Republicans. The two men would be defeated handedly in the post-JFK assassination blue wave. Bush by Democratic Senator Ralph Yarborough, and Crichton by LBJ protege Governor John Connally, the man who shared a bullet with Kennedy. Bush and Crichton also shared a common acquaintance, the ubiquitous George de Mohrenschildt. After Russian George's death by apparent suicide in April 1977, weeks before he was set to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and a couple of months after Bush ended his stint as CIA director, investigators found in the deceased de Mohrenschildt's Rolodex a number and address associated with George H.W. Bush himself, noted there as the president of Zapata Off-Shore. De Mohrenschildt had even written a letter to Bush while he was CIA director in 1976, asking him if he could, quote, bring a solution into the hopeless situation I find myself in, end quote. That hopeless situation was likely an upcoming questioning by the House Select Committee on Assassinations regarding George and his wife Jean de Mohrenschildt's spontaneous friendship with Lee Harvey Oswald and his Russian wife Marina in late 1962 and into early 1963, a little under a year before the assassination of JFK. The ever-generous de Mohrenschildts had even been the ones to introduce the Oswalds to Ruth Paine, the woman who would help Lee get a job at the now iconic Texas School Book Depository, where he allegedly shot the president. Now, I could go much deeper into this relationship between the Russian oil tycoon and the reportedly loser drifter Oswald, but I'll save it for another time. What I will leave you with as we leave de Mohrenschildt is the proposition that the two Georges, de Mohrenschildt and Bush, were likely serving a similar purpose to the CIA in the Caribbean. Both were oil and gas executives that traveled across the Caribbean in connection with ongoing intrigue. Russ Baker points out, for example, that the de Mohrenschildts happened to be taking a quote-unquote walking trip through Guatemala just as the Bay of Pigs invaders of Brigade 2506 were undergoing their training at base tracks. Could they have been a part of the same Allen Dulles pilot project, planting CIA assets into the oil industry as covert assets? They both seem to have served a similar role, with Bush admittedly achieving greater heights, especially after his critical role as a paymaster and cover asset for the Bay of Pigs invasion. What remains certain to me is that George Bush, the upstart oil executive from the Northeast, was clearly involved in intelligence operations far before his reported start at the CIA when he was appointed as director all the way in 1976. Hell, I didn't even mention the often cited November 29, 1963 memo from J. Edgar Hoover, where he bluntly labels Poppy as quote-unquote George Bush of the CIA. All that to say, the evidence is overwhelming that Bush started his career as an operator and likely remained tapped into that world of spycraft for the rest of his life. Official histories that say the opposite are clearly either 1, misleading you, or have not done their proper research. Bush was a key pioneer in the privatization of American intelligence, a process that had been ongoing since its inception, but that would really kick off following the Bay of Pigs disaster and the Kennedy brothers' increased scrutiny and demand for control of the agency. Speaking of which, let me close this off with a few words on the Bay of Pigs invasion before we wrap up for today. As in the next video, we cross from pre-Bay of Pigs anti-Castro operations to post-Bay of Pigs, which will bring a marked difference in policy. Now, much has already been said about the CIA's failed attempt to invade Cuba in 1961, so I will not harp on it for too long. More important than the event itself was the aftermath that it engendered. Allen Dulles, the CIA director for 8 years, had faced a near-universal green light from President Eisenhower for the bulk of his tenure. The young Kennedy was different. He required explanation and transparency, two qualities that made the spooks, especially Allen Dulles, uncomfortable. The question that is often raised surrounding the Bay of Pigs fiasco is that of air support. It appears that Dulles knew that his plan to send 1,500 or so ragtag exiles to undertake a full-on amphibious assault on Cuba and to establish a pro-US government in arms was a pipe dream. He did, after all, smoke a pipe. But it did remain a pipe dream unless, of course, the president ordered air support, firstly to destroy Castro's small but competent suite of planes while they were grounded, and then to provide direct support to his landing party. Under old General Eisenhower, Dulles knew that he had a supportive president that would provide anything to complement his policy goals. I mean, he was working with Vice President Nixon at the time at the top of the Bay of Pigs planning staff. This was a complementary effort. Yet under Kennedy, air support was not so certain. The idealistic JFK did not want to reveal an American hand in the invasion, and Dulles knew this. So he took a gamble. He told Kennedy that the invasion would not require air support, and that Castro did not have pilots for his planes. These were both lies. He hoped that he could pressure the young president to take a decisive action when push came to shove, and to guarantee victory. In many ways, this could have been a test by the elder spymaster. How far can I push this president? Can he be turned into another Ike? As we all know, Kennedy did not crack, and the invasion, of course, turned into an abject failure, a humiliating defeat for the United States, and an unfathomable propaganda victory for Fidel Castro. JFK, only 3 months into his first term, was forced to publicly take the blame on live television for all of America to see. Today, with the benefits of hindsight, we understand that the Bay of Pigs situation was far more nuanced than it appeared at the time, and that Kennedy was really only partially to blame, if at all. Although it is almost a consensus opinion that the Bay of Pigs fiasco falls squarely on the CIA, at the time, in the 1960s, the public viewed it differently. Kennedy was being called a secret communist in the right-wing press, with Henry Luce's Time magazine scorning the young president. Although Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell's stated plan of ousting Castro failed, they did manage to prove to the coalition of Americans skeptical of the liberal Kennedy that he was indeed not the cold warrior that they had hoped to see in the highest office. The China lobby, having seen the power of CIA coups in Guatemala in 1954 under President Ike, were convinced that the Massachusetts senator was not the man for the job. The organized crime syndicates, brought directly into the Castro assassination plots and parts of the invasion, saw that JFK would not be the man to bring back their casinos and hotels. The Texas cowboys, salivating at Cuba's untapped oil wealth, were galvanized in their opinion that JFK's Texan vice president, Lyndon Johnson, would make a far better president than the kid from New England. And finally, the CIA spooks, after months of planning and training, had to not only watch their operation fail miserably, but also had to sit back while their chief, Allen Dulles, and his deputies, Richard Bissell and Charles Cabell, were forced to resign by the end of 1961 and 62. And that was only the beginning of their troubles, as the Kennedy brothers tightened their grip on the anti-Castro operations. JFK, in a move much like President Eisenhower did with Nixon, put his brother Bobby at the top of the White House anti-Castro task force to ensure White House control of the project. Then they put their lame duck CIA director John McCone in place at the top spot at Langley. And for the first time in its history, the CIA was being reined in. However, contrary to popular depictions, under the Kennedy brothers, anti-Castro operations would actually balloon out of control, both orchestrated by the CIA and by private backers, many of whom we have already discussed. Although the Bay of Pigs fiasco had embarrassed the Kennedys, the war had just begun, and that war would ultimately lead to his own downfall. We will start next time in the heart of the Cuban circuit post-Bay of Pigs, in Miami, at the legendary JM Wave station, where an unassuming CIA man named Theodore Shackley was elevated to his first of many major roles in the agency, as the station chief at the largest US spy station in the world. The blonde ghost had emerged. Thank you all as always for watching, and please, if you enjoyed today's video, leave a like and a comment down below, letting me know what you thought. As always, it helps a lot with the algorithm. The video you watched today first aired to my Patreon subscribers on November 13th, 2024. As this is the last video of Season 2 of Eyes Wide Open, I wanted to take a moment to really thank my Patreon supporters, as I could not have taken the time aside to make these 11 videos without their support. So on screen now, one final time this year, are the names of my producer tier patrons that were signed up at any time throughout 2024 when I was producing these previous videos. As you know, and as always, when you watch Eyes Wide Open on YouTube, it is always ad-free. I do not make any money off of YouTube ads, nor sponsors, which allows me to say what I want and not worry about keeping my content within the confines of YouTube's stringent monetization policy. That said, I am completely dependent on individual support to do the work that I do. So with that, thank you very much to my Patreon supporters. I also want to take a moment here and highlight something that I haven't before, and that is the fact that Eyes Wide Open will always remain AI free. Everything you see in these videos, from the research, writing, narration, and editing, were all produced by my own exclusive human labor. In a time of AI mass proliferation and the generation of false images on demand, I do personally believe, especially in the history space, that human-created content and the proliferation of real filmed images is more important than ever. That is always going to be a guarantee here on Eyes Wide Open, forever. So with all that said, this last part of the Bush series wraps up Season 2 of Eyes Wide Open, and what a journey it has been. Starting back in Southeast Asia with a focus on Laos and Vietnam, I then shifted back stateside to follow the military-industrial complex and the secret war against Castro, two key factors in the future Vietnam War and secret war in Laos. Season 3 of Eyes Wide Open, which is well on its way on Patreon already since January of 2025, picks up right where we left off at the end of this Bush miniseries. So far on Patreon, I have 3 full-length documentaries, getting into the Kennedy White House, the early origins of the CIA station chief in Miami, Ted Shackley, and a very well-received video about the JM Wave station in Miami, Florida, and the rollout of Operation Mongoose. These 3 videos are all at least an hour long. I have also begun to upload my next long-form series, titled The Road to Dallas. The JFK assassination has surely been on all of our minds lately, especially with the recent release of additional files by the Trump administration in early 2025. With that said, I have started my long, winding journey to that fateful day in Dallas in November of 1963. So far, I've uploaded the first 3 parts, which total a little over an hour altogether, and these include a primer video going over my thoughts about the JFK assassination and my methodology, and 2 more videos that are deep dives on key players, in my estimation anyways, Frank Sturgis and David Atlee Phillips. All of this is available on Patreon right now, which totals about 5 hours give or take of content. These videos will of course come to YouTube for free eventually, much like Season 2 did. But unfortunately, that will have to wait for quite a bit later this year. So with all that said, I just want to take this moment and say thank you all for watching, and for all of your positive and negative feedback on Eyes Wide Open Season 2. I am always trying to make a better product and always trying to improve myself, and I feel like throughout this past season I've really upped the ante, and I hope to as well in Season 3 with some really groundbreaking research, I believe. I am, as always, present on Twitter X if you do wish to follow me for regular updates. I do recommend you check me out there. That said, this is not a goodbye, but instead a see you later. I hope you all take care in these uncertain times, and that, as always, you keep your eyes wide open. Talk to you all soon.